The realities of the present are the result of a continuous process of the status quo coming into conflict with contrasting ideologies, leading to a synthesis of positions and a continuation of the process. The past remains with us in tangible ways, even if we don't see it that way. As we move further and further away from the past, we tend to lose sight of the people, decisions, and situations that gave birth to the present. In this content series, we're going to take a look at the history of incarceration in the United States, paying particular attention to how the crisis at the Cuyahoga County Jail came to be. Before we had the Constitution, there were the Articles of Confederation, which were the first attempt at governing the post-revolutionary United States. These were an absolute failure and were only in force for just 8 years. One lasting aspect of the Articles of Confederation was Article 4, Clause 2, which established interstate extradition and ultimately provided a legal basis for fugitive slave extradition in the 1789 Constitution. This Constitution, which is the same one we have today, also made the vote of enslaved persons 3/5 the vote of free persons, allowed Congress to tax the slave trade, and put an end to slavery. Following the Revolutionary War and into the antebellum period, incarceration, criminal punishment, and rehabilitation underwent a massive shift from the British norm imposed on the colonies. This shift in thinking was driven by the spirit of 1776 and the need to abandon the colonial British way of doing things. Early criminal punishments focused on fines, shaming, banishment, and corporal and capital punishment. Bail was normal, and jails were used as temporary holding facilities. As people immigrated into the United States, community bonds were weakened, and new forms of criminal justice were needed. This change brought about the creation of the first prison. By the 1800s, 11 states had prisons and allowed for incarceration as criminal punishment. By the 1820s, 12 states allowed for hard labor. By the 1830s, prisons were here to stay. There were two penal schools of thought: the Auburn School of communal labor and solitary housing, and the Pennsylvania system of total solitary confinement. The Auburn system won out, and states began implementing penal industries and inmate leasing in the 1850s. Reformers saw immorality, delinquency, and vice as the cause of crime, and the cure was to remove criminals from society, to reform them. This ended community approaches to criminal justice. The end of the Civil War and beginning of Reconstruction brought about many systemic changes to the United States that persist into the present day, fundamentally unchanged. First among these were the Reconstruction Amendments, which are Amendments 13, 14, and 15. The most direct response to insurgent states was the 13th Amendment, which expanded the Emancipation Proclamation and definitively ended most forms of slavery, but codified the legality of penal slavery. At the same time, Americans began mobilizing to reform the penal system because of the abysmal conditions in the prison. Throughout the 1800s, prison oversight was functionally non-existent, which meant that atrocities were allowed to occur in the prisons, and in some cases were endorsed by the administration. In the North, inmates were subjected to penal slavery and inmate leasing, combined with medieval torture under the theory of social Darwinism. This included human experimentation, eugenics, and forced sterilization. In the South, Black Americans were targeted by the Black Codes and Jim Crow laws and were funneled into the prisons in order to keep them enslaved. This was supported by white paramilitary groups like the KKK. Southern prisons also adopted penal slavery and inmate leasing, which exists today. Responding to the conditions in America's prisons, reformers met in Cincinnati in October of 1870 at the National Congress of Penitentiary and Reformatory Discipline. This organization is the ancestor of the American Correctional Association, which is the primary professional association for penal administration in the United States today. Most of the National Congress' 37 principles are progressive by today's standards, and some have been adopted as best practice, including prison statistics, the National Prisons Bureau, a progressive classification system, and good time credits. Nevertheless, these reformers were eugenicists, and their belief in eugenics led to the many contradictions we have in our prisons today. Over time, the atrocities committed under the inmate leasing system became apparent to the public, and it was gradually replaced by prison farms and chain gangs. These practices were also rife with human rights violations. Many prison farms still exist in the southern United States. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the conditions in the prisons led to riots and a wave of court cases that recognized inmates' constitutional rights. From the 1980s to the 2000s, America was plagued by the law and order movement, which replaced inmates' rights with tough-on-crime politics, a policy best attributed to Ronald Reagan. Beginning with Richard Nixon, the war on drugs ushered in a resurgence of regressive penal practices, culminating in Ronald Reagan's Comprehensive Crime Control Act and the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts. Tough-on-crime politics saw the federal government as key to deterring drug crimes. This movement was characterized by racist, sexist, and homophobic dog whistling, and is similar to the Black Codes and Jim Crow laws in the Reconstructed South. Reagan created the U.S. Sentencing Commission and the Federal Sentencing Guidelines, introduced sentence enhancements for gun crimes, abolished federal parole, expanded mandatory minimums for drug crimes, and re-legalized the federal death penalty. From 1970 through the 2010s, Ohio underwent massive criminal justice reform. In the 70s, Ohio established minimum sentence ranges as a compromise between determinate and indeterminate sentencing. In 1984, SB 199 established mandatory minimums for some felonies, for repeat offenders, and for gun crimes. This decision resulted in mass incarceration and led to jail and prison overpopulation. In the late 80s, the Committee on Prison Crowding recommended the introduction of earned credit and parole, as well as the expansion of prison diversion. Later in 1990, the Ohio Sentencing Commission was formed to standardize judicial practices across the state. On July 1st, 1993, the Ohio Sentencing Commission recommended that the state adopt determinate sentencing, where other states and the federal government had now introduced grid-based systems. In 1996, SB 2 expanded on this by allowing limited judicial discretion within a system of determinate sentencing. It also introduced bad time, or inmate recidivism can lead to longer sentences. This was ruled unconstitutional in 2000 by the Ohio Supreme Court. Further reforms in 2011 and 2012 raised felony theft thresholds, capped some felony sentences, allowed inmates to reduce their sentences by completing programming, expanded judicial release, and required community diversion. This is where Ohio is today. The war on drugs and the regressive policies that followed are the direct cause of the mass incarceration we have today. The unwillingness of state and local governments to combat the inherently racist and violent practice is also the cause of the horrors that continue to occur. In response to these crises, state and federal governments have moved towards private jails and prisons. As of 2019, 8.1% of the national prison population is housed in a private prison. Among federal prisons, this number is 15.7%. Among state prisons, it's 7.1%. As of 2021, 14% of Ohio prisoners are housed in private facilities. Atrocities in the Cuyahoga County Jail are nothing new, and the county has never shown that it can competently operate its jail. Over the years, there have been 6 versions of the Cuyahoga County Jail. The first jail was built just 3 years after the county came into existence. From 1813 to 1858, the county went through 3 different jails, and the 4th jail was built in 1875 to address the poor conditions of the 3rd. In 1886 and 1899, former inmates reported about the deplorable conditions within the jail, including rats, roaches, open sewage, infestations, and inedible food. But conditions continue to worsen. In a situation all too familiar to us today, in 1903 and 1904, the county planned to build a new facility to address the atrocities in the 4th jail, but couldn't get funding approved by residents for the project. Conditions continued to worsen. In 1923, the state of Ohio intervened, and a new jail was finally built in 1931, nearly 30 to 40 years after the public learned about the abhorrent conditions. But the 5th jail wasn't the solution it was intended to be, and by 1968, conditions were just as bad as they were nearly 100 years earlier. In 1968, the 5th Cuyahoga County Jail was overcrowded at nearly double its capacity. Residents again rejected a proposal to fund the construction of a new jail, and inmates set fire to their beds and rioted. The police suppressed the riot, and 100 inmates were transferred to the Cleveland Workhouse, which was closed in 2018 as part of the county's regionalization of local jails. What is now the Justice Center was proposed in 1969 and completed in 1976, with Jail 2 being completed in 1995. Overall, the Justice Center cost nearly $1.1 billion in today's money. After nearly 20 years of corruption, Cuyahoga County was reorganized under a charter, and former FBI agent Ed Fitzgerald was elected to serve as our first county commissioner. Ed ran on a platform of accountability and cost-cutting, with consolidation and regionalization playing a large part in the process. Prior to leaving office, Ed put into motion a plan to regionalize all local jails into a single county facility that would simplify local criminal justice and generate immense revenue for the county. These decisions are the origin of the horrors described in the U.S. Marshals Report in 2018. In 2018, the U.S. Marshal Service investigated the Cuyahoga County Jail at the request of County Executive Armin Budish. Their findings are abhorrent. Overall, The U.S. Marshal scored the jail as unsatisfactory at risk, which means that most contractual requirements were not met and were unlikely to be met without major reforms. Among the problems, they found that some jail deaths were unexplainable, that food was used as a punishment, that inmates were deprived of basic hygiene and privacy, and that the facility was not PREA compliant. These issues come alongside nearly 30 deaths in the county jail. The United States has been widely condemned at home and abroad, as have the continued legality and use of penal slavery and torture. Cuyahoga County has played a unique role in this history of violence and abuse, and our county government has yet to uphold human rights in its own criminal justice ecosystem, something it has failed to do for over 200 years. Now, we have the opportunity to chart a new course, where jail deaths and abuse by guards are a thing of the past. Criminality is a solvable issue, but without addressing the material conditions we experience, we will repeat the failures of the past. We hope you'll join us in this fight for a brighter future for Cuyahoga County. Thank you for joining us on this adventure as we explore the history of incarceration in these United States, specifically focusing on Cuyahoga County. To culminate this journey, we're releasing our full report entitled the Cuyahoga Justice Reform Framework in the hopes the county will read it, understand it, and enact the reforms we seek. If you want to read the report, check it out on our website, here, at a button at the top entitled CJRF. You can also check us out on our socials.